Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Professor Colin McFarlane, who is professor in the Department of Geography at Durham University. His research revolves around the experience and politics of the city. In his current work, he is particularly interested in three aspects. First, the production, experience, and perception of density in cities. Second, the making and remaking of urban worlds. And third, the relations between sanitation and the city, in particular, the growing urban sanitation crisis. Colin has won several prestigious research grants, including a Leverhulme Prize and a European Research Council Consolidator grant. He's the author of numerous publications. For reasons of time, I will just mention his single-authored monographs here, all of which are clearly related to the project that he will be talking about today. First, his book, Learning the City, Knowledge and Translocal Assemblage, published in 2011. Then Fragments of the City, Making and Remaking Urban Worlds, published in 2021 by the University of California Press. And the most recent output is Waste and the City, The Crisis of Sanitation and the Right to City Life, published in this year, 2023, by Verso. The title of his guest lecture today, as you can see, is Sanitation for All, Cities and the Right to City Life. Colin, we are very happy to have you here. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for making yourself available.
Thank you, and thank you very much for organising this. To everyone who's helped make this lecture series possible, which is a great series of lectures, and it's very nice to be part of it, and also to be talking to colleagues in the university, which is something I always enjoy doing. So I've got my script here, so I will kind of be looking a little bit at some of my notes as I talk, and hopefully there'll be some time for discussion at the end. So the book that you just mentioned, Waste in the City, is really the heart of what I'm going to say today. That book was published a couple of months ago, so it's still very fresh in my mind. And what the book tries to argue is that we are in a global sanitation crisis in cities. And this is a crisis that's not limited to a particular place. It is global in dimension. And as a geographer, I'm interested in how its global dimensions take shape in different parts of the urban world. And my argument in the book is we need to pay, I think, much more attention to the sanitation crisis. And I'm going to begin with four snapshots of this global urban sanitation crisis, just to give you a sense of different aspects of it. And I'll go on to argue that one way to understand it and to address this global sanitation crisis is through what I call the right to city life, which is the subtitle of the talk, but also of the book. So first of all, failing infrastructures. This is the first of the four snapshots. And this, I'm going to begin with a comment from a worker in India, in Mumbai, called Surajadan Turat, who talks about being submerged up to my shoulders in slush, feeling like his feet were being pulled down, but somehow grabbing on to a slab, and then having people pull me up, and then I pass out. This is a quote from a manual scavenger working in northeast Mumbai, cleaning out underneath a Mumbai community toilet block. And this is not an isolated case. In a 3-month period of 2016 alone, there were 7 deaths in Mumbai from similar incidents of people falling into septic tanks or makeshift sewers underneath toilets in Mumbai. These could be people who were working or people who were visiting the toilet just to answer the call of nature in a very busy neighborhood. In 2018, a 40-year-old municipal toilet block entirely collapsed in Mumbai, killing 1 person. Residents said that the municipality hadn't maintained the toilet in 10 years. And then in 2020, 2 years later, another toilet block nearby had its side wall collapse, killing a woman who was using one of the cubicles in the toilet. And this isn't just a story from Mumbai, of course. In 2019, a girl in Kenya died when the school latrine that she was using collapsed. In the same year, in Limpopo province in South Africa, a 3-year-old, Amoro Mononi, died while visiting his aunt when he fell into the pit underneath the toilet in the house and drowned. In addition to these shocking, horrific cases that are littered across the urban world every year, are the thousands of everyday struggles with inadequate toilets. So when local community toilet blocks are vulnerable to collapse, and when most lack water, electricity, and in many cases functional doors, then the material conditions of the toilet shape social life in profound ways. Residents are often forced to do the dangerous and exhausting work of maintaining toilets, drains, pipes, and water themselves. These infrastructural worlds of water and sanitation require often heavily gendered labour, with women and girls in particular taking on the toll of the work. At toilets, privacy and safety become compromised, and the kinds of people who feel comfortable using these toilets reduces and narrows. Add to that the sheer pressure of numbers of people using these toilets in communities, in informal neighbourhoods often, in the global south, and you get added problems of exclusion, particularly around gender, age, disability, caste, ethnicity, and so on. In some parts of urban India, the numbers of people to a single toilet seat are 1 in every 200 people, which is a tortuous equation of urban density and woeful provisioning. Urban sanitation infrastructure is not only in very poor condition and inadequate, people are dying trying to fix it. Consider, for example, the ongoing scandal of manual scavenging in India, with which I sort of opened a moment ago. In Hyderabad, for example, a manual scavenger emerges from a blocked drain. Squeezed into a narrow pipe surrounded by raw sewage, he uses his bare hands to attack the blockage. In Delhi, 3 men are killed trying to unblock a drain underneath the Indira Gandhi National Centre for the Arts. In Chennai, 2 men die attempting to unblock a 40-foot deep septic tank underneath a hotel. The men, typically working without any safety gear, were killed by asphyxiation and toxic gases. Mohan from Delhi told the Indian Express, "I've seen both my friends Deepak and Balwinder die in front of my own eyes. We told the contractors that the fire from the matchstick is not sustained in the sewer, but he ignored us. My friends were asphyxiated. They just needed some money that day to eat." Now, these stories of death from cleaning drains and sewers multiply in cities across India and beyond. Manual scavenging is the practice of unblocking and cleaning toilets and drains, and is conducted in India by low-caste Dalits, often referred to as untouchable. Around 1.3 million people, lower caste Indians, make a living through manual scavenging at the moment. Most of them are women, paid less than the minimum wage, using boards, buckets, and baskets, often carried on their heads. The Safai Kamarachi Andolan, or SKA, is a movement that advocates for the rights of manual scavengers and campaigns to end this practice through protests, retraining, support, and mechanisation. Had members of other castes been involved, said SKA founder Biswanda Wilson, some solution would surely have been found. So this then is the first snapshot, these working and living around these inadequate and often highly dangerous toilet blocks. The second snapshot I want to begin with is on race, poverty, and sanitation. I want to switch contexts as I go through these snapshots. The small town of Centerville in America is one of the poorest in the country. Here, residents have been living with raw sewage for decades, accustomed to the thick stench in the air. When it rains, the sewage spills out of the network and across the city into homes, gardens, play areas, and open spaces. The pipes, pumps, and drainage are old and damaged, and manhole covers spout sewer water like geysers at pressured towns. The water doesn't taste right. Illinois American Water, which supplies much of the town's water, insists that the water is safe to drink, but people often buy bottled water. The smell means that it's sometimes difficult to sit outside, and some worry about the effect of the air on their lungs. There are stories of children becoming frightened of the rain, homes have lost their value, and land is subsiding in several places. Can you imagine, asked one resident, bringing your family up in waste? After working all your life, you've got to live in waste and retire in it. A town of 5,000 predominantly black residents, Centerville has long been neglected by state authorities. The water utility, activists claim, has ignored the residents. In the summer of 2021, the activists filed a lawsuit against the sewer authority and the local state, demanding repairs and proper investments across Centerville and the United States more generally. One prominent activist who has campaigned on sewage and poverty right across the country, Catherine Flowers, described the town's sanitation conditions as one of the worst I had ever seen. The city's mayor claimed that the task was beyond the scope of the city's small budget and would require federal support. Yet the plan that has been put forward for federal funding involved no consultation with residents or groups and did not go anywhere near far enough. As elsewhere, residents have often been left cleaning up the mess and maintaining the systems themselves. Catherine Flowers, has documented cases of open sewage across urban and rural America and sees a problem as one of race and class. This, she says, is the final monument to the Confederacy. The third snapshot I want to narrate to give you a sense of the global urban sanitation crisis takes us closer to home. If you walk along the River Thames in central London, a short jaunt just north of Big Ben and Parliament, you might see a small and very discreet statue memorialising one of Britain's most important sanitation engineers. And it's easy to miss the small bust of a serious-looking Victorian man embossed with the writing Sir Joseph Bazalgette, CB, engineer of the London main drainage system and of this embankment. A few metres below the memorial lies part of the sewer system that his name will forever be linked with. Built in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, Bazalgette's system of sewers remain amongst the most remarkable feats of engineering in London's history. The Metropolitan Board of Works, which Bazalgette was chief engineer of, constructed 5 sewers 36 feet beneath the surface, running parallel to the Thames, and consisting of 82 miles of main lines, 1,000 miles of smaller lines, 318 million bricks, and 880,000 cubic yards of concrete. Accounts at the time compared it with the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So sanitation provision in British cities has always had its limitations and exclusions nonetheless. And I don't want to romanticize the trope of the heroic sort of Victorian man, but we have come a long way nonetheless since these heady days of sanitation innovation in Britain. Today in Britain, there is no statutory legal requirement for state provision of public toilets. Local authority spending on public toilets in British cities has severely declined in recent decades, and some regions have almost entirely stopped maintaining public toilets altogether. In the face of austerity cuts from central governments to local bodies, public toilets were among the first provisions to be cut. In London, for example, more than half of all public toilets were closed after 1995. The central borough of Tower Hamlets has just 1 public toilet, yet is the densest in the capital. Many British cities do not have dedicated public toilet policies, and because they have no legal duty to provide public toilets, they don't often improve what provision exists already, and they typically don't have ring-fenced budgets for toilets. The numbers of people affected in a city the size of London is remarkable. Over 1 million people aged over 65, over 1 million people disabled, 500,000 people with Crohn's and colitis, and many more people breastfeeding, pregnant, suffering from conditions that make getting to a toilet quickly vital. As much as 20% of the UK population experiences what has been sometimes called the loo leash, whereby inadequate toilets deter people from leaving their home as much as they'd wish. At the same time, people who are homeless or part of the growing army of delivery drivers in the gig economy or working in the nighttime economy find that there are often simply no toilets available at all. The London Assembly, a public body tasked with scrutinising the work of the mayor, has made the argument that public toilet provision in London isn't just a moral and health improvement, but also an economic investment. The failure to provide decent toilets could well be in violation of the UK's Equalities Act, given that many of the groups who are denied and vulnerable to a lack of toilets, the disabled, elderly groups, for instance, or those with certain illnesses, are the ones who suffer the most and often on the lower incomes. And then fourth and finally, the last snapshot I want to use to communicate the sort of dimensions or some of the dimensions of the global urban sanitation crisis is around infectious disease. Hussein Ali, a resident of the town of Bebnine in North Lebanon, described his town in the grip of a cholera outbreak that has impacted his family and his neighbours. "We don't know where we got infected from," he said. "Is it the air or the water? We're living in a state of panic. We're afraid of everything now." In Lebanon, economic crisis has rendered many key infrastructures dysfunctional, including electricity, treatment plants, water and sanitation. The last known cholera outbreak was 30 years ago. In recent years, there have been hundreds of suspected cases. In Bebnine, a river of brown water runs through the centre of the town, piped into some homes and spilling into nearby cropland. Residents worry about whether the crops they grow are safe, but there is little alternative food. Cholera can be treated, as we know, but rapid care is essential. Health services are struggling to cope more than ever, and while the government has said it will cover the costs of cholera for its citizens, there are 1 million refugees in Lebanon, many from Syria, who cannot have costs covered, but who are amongst the most vulnerable. 29 countries reported cholera outbreaks in 2022. The World Health Organization has described the global rise in cholera as unprecedented, noting that at the same time, there is a global shortage of vaccine supply. Last summer, cholera cases in Syria climbed to 25,000 infections. Refugee camps, often crowded, lacking basic infrastructure like sanitation, had the highest levels of infection. Over the past few decades, epidemics and pandemics of fecal-associated infectious disease have become worryingly more commonplace. As cities continue to expand into rural areas, the potential of waste and infection to mix intensifies. The combination of cities spreading into new habitats, massive agricultural economies, ecological destruction, and mass global trade has led to new pathways for infections to which vulnerable and previously unexposed people are the most susceptible. Agents like Salmonella or E. coli or coronaviruses are now more likely to move from animals to humans, often through manure. And to be clear, this issue is not one of sort of low-income residents on the edges of cities alone, but it's really to do with the failure of investment in adequate infrastructure and services to support people as cities grow. So nearly 2/3 of human pathogens are zoonotic in origin, and urbanization, climate change, and inequality are increasing the risks of successful leaps from animals to humans. Most of these pathogens lack the high infection potential of COVID-19, but that does not mean that they are without serious consequence. In addition to the risk of industrialized food production, especially through poultry, there is exposure to animal feces in cities through household livestock, small-scale farming, markets, slaughterhouses, and free-roaming animals. All of this is linked to a range of health consequences, from diarrhea to soil-transmitted helminth infection, trachoma, environmental enteric dysfunction, stunted growth in children, long-term consequences for pregnant women, and those who are immunocompromised. 1/3 of deaths among children under 5 are due to diarrhea caused by pathogens that can be found in animal feces. So what these 4 snapshots that I've opened with tell us is that sanitation is a fundamentally networked problem. And by this, I mean that sanitation is always spilling over into other kinds of issues. It's always more than just toilets alone, and it needs to be understood and addressed as such. It's an approach that I'm taking here that much research and policy has failed to meaningfully grapple with. Sanitation is fundamental to poverty, inequality, and life in the city. It's about infrastructure and toilets for sure, but it's also about gender, race, disability, caste, education, health, and labour. It's about how a city welcomes its refugees. It's about utilities, spending, and governance. It's about the law, but it's also about microbes and infectious diseases spilling between animals and humans and across global networks. So these snapshots then are not just abstract issues, they are human and environmental stories of people, families, schools, and everyday living. So what then is the global picture? So more than half of the global urban population lacks access to safely managed sanitation facilities. Over 1 billion people resort to open defecation in unsanitary locations such as under bridges, garbage grounds, railway tracks, and riverbanks. Preventable deaths and health consequences are a major and ongoing problem. In 2016, over 1.5 million people died from diarrhea, entirely preventable, with a significant portion being children under the age of 5. And nowhere near enough investment is being made to address these concerns. Despite the urgent need, less than 1/3 of the required investments in water and sanitation are being made. The world's countries spend between 0.05% and 2.4% of GDP on subsidies for water and sanitation, for example. And the need is growing with the climate crisis, which is intensifying the sanitation crisis, particularly through flooding, but also through drought. The impact is disproportionately borne by the poorest communities, with increased risks of waterborne diseases and additional annual deaths predicted by 2050. At the moment, Unsafe sanitation results in massive economic losses, estimated at around 223 billion US dollars per year. And considering the health costs, lost productivity, and lost wages. Inadequate sanitation can cost developing countries up to 7% of their GDP in lost productivity. But investing in sanitation yields significant economic returns, with every dollar invested generating estimates of between $5.50 and $9. The cost of providing basic sanitation, water, and hygiene for all is estimated at around $114 billion per year over a 15-year period. This is data from the World Bank, which is significantly less than the economic losses incurred due to a lack of proper sanitation. So as the world's urban population continues to grow, the poorest neighborhoods are the ones that grow fastest. The already insufficient sanitation, water, and waste systems face increasingly high demands. It is projected that cities will accommodate an additional 2.5 billion people by 2050, exacerbating the sanitation crisis. And cities are increasingly fragmented, spatially, into richer and poorer areas. 1 in every 3 or 4 residents, over 1 billion people, live in so-called slums, while the percentage of people living in these so-called slums has reduced from 46% to 30%. The absolute numbers of people living in informal settlements or slums has grown from 690 to 880 million. Given that the counting of poorer residents is often unreliable, the actual number is likely to be much higher. But even if you go with the numbers that we do have, it is still more than half of the population of sub-Saharan Africa living in poorer neighborhoods. And it is here where the urban sanitation crisis is often at its worst. At the same time, I'm mindful here of the risk of portraying low-income neighborhoods as sites of despair, replete with infection, illness, and struggle. That, of course, is only part of the story. I'm talking here about neighborhoods, not the image that's conjured by the often pejorative term slum. They are neighborhoods like any other neighborhood, but with significant challenges caused by poverty and state disinvestment and abandonment. And as I will briefly touch on, residents themselves are often involved in the production of solutions, but cannot and should not be expected to solve this crisis on their own. The failure to prioritize and invest in urban sanitation crises by states all over the world means that we will not meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal for sanitation, which aims to provide adequate sanitation for all by 2030. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, as many as 89 countries said they were not on track to meet this SDG target. But while the SDG sanitation target was vital in focusing minds, consider how sanitation for all is understood in the SDGs. The key category used to measure the provision of sanitation through the SDG UN system is that of improved sanitation. That's the top 3 on the slide in front of you, including safely managed, basic, and limited sanitation. These 3 constitute improved sanitation in the measure of progress mobilized by the World Health Organization and UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme for Water, Sanitation and Hygiene, or GMP, as it's called. This is the task group which is tasked with monitoring global water and sanitation supply. Excuse me. But this definition of improved facilities includes a wide range of conditions. Safely managed sanitation refers to basic facilities where waste is safely disposed of either in situ or off-site. The next one down, basic sanitation, refers to toilets that are not shared across households, so households that have their own toilets. And finally, limited facilities refers to decent toilets shared between 2 or more households. All of these improved facilities must include the safe separation of human waste and people. But because the definition of improved is so broad, ranging across these 3 categories, in practice, the monitoring data can mistakenly include very poor sanitation facilities, including toilets, where waste is spilled untreated into the local area. Globally, around 1/3 of people who have access to sanitation, mistakenly defined as improved by the GMP, have connections to sewer systems with no waste treatment. Only 6% of Nigeria's urban homes have their own toilet connected to a sewer, yet 39% of provisions are deemed improved. even if that includes shared facilities that are not safely managed and that lack decent provisions of water, hygiene, care, menstrual supplies, and so on. Improved facilities can mistakenly include a diverse array of systems in the monitoring data, including septic tanks that, as one GMP report notes, are not watertight and which are effectively cesspools. And that's from the GMP's own descriptions. So the GMP is tasked with this global task of creating definitions that work across different locations and forms of data collection. And so it's understandable that the categories at work are broad. However, in lumping together such markedly different forms of sanitation under the threefold category of improved, the definition may do more harm than good. At worst, it implies that what are in practice profoundly unreliable and unhealthy provisions are acceptable. And we're not even going to meet the SDG target under this current criteria in any case. So we need a comprehensive approach to tackle the multifaceted sanitation challenges that exist globally. So in the book that I described at the start, which was published this August, I argue that one way to understand and respond to the growing urban sanitation crisis is through a focus on what I call the right to city life. So this is the book. The sanitation, as I've been suggesting, is not only about toilets. It is instead an integral part of urban life, encompassing everything from living conditions and health to education, work, and well-being, to the overall ability to participate in city activities, socially, economically. In short, it is a question of city life, the ability to survive and thrive in the city or not. The concept of the right to the city, popularized by the French theorist Henri Lefebvre, views the city as a site of both exploitation and transformation. It goes beyond specific rights and encompasses a broader right to urban life, including the ability to shape planning priorities, budgetary decisions, and to live a fulfilling life in the city. By using the couplet city life, connecting city and life together, I'm trying to keep in view the ways in which urban sanitation is always already about life itself. This includes living and dying, living healthily or just about struggling by, surviving and thriving, and life in all its guises, from human bodies and wastes to the microbial world to the wider ecologies that compose and are impacted by sanitation. There is an historical connection between sanitation and rights in cities. Throughout history, struggles for sanitation have been intertwined with fights for human rights and social justice. We might think, for example, of colonial subjects resisting imposed sanitation regimes, civil rights activists in the United States advocating for improved sanitation, campaigns against pay toilets that disproportionately affect women, and so on. In the 1970s, for example, the Committee to End Pay Toilets in America, or CEPTIA, formed by a group of students, played a pivotal role in ending pay toilets across several cities. The group ran campaigns and a newsletter, which was wonderfully called Free Toilet Paper, and was cited as a key influence in Chicago's decision to ban pay toilets in 1973. Pay toilets are, the CEPTIA wrote in their newsletter, a disgrace and quite possibly a violation of our civil rights, exploiting human discomfort for commercial purposes. Gender was at the center of CEPTIA's campaigning, given that it was cubicles, not urinals, that were charged, meaning that women paid more than men did. Move 50 years forward and switch context to India, and a group called The Right to Pee is similarly campaigning against women being charged more to use toilets. In Mumbai, the Right to Pee movement amassed a body of data about sanitation across the city. They began by surveying 129 city toilet blocks and lobbying the state on its relative neglect of budgetary spending on sanitation for women and girls. They launched a public signature campaign in the railway stations, calling for an improvement to the woefully inadequate and usually broken or poorly maintained toilets across the rail network. And given that Mumbai's rail network is one of the busiest in the world, the provisions that do exist fall far short of need in what are often very extremely crowded train stations. One of its organizers, one of the Right to Pee organizers, has said, today the Right to Pee is everyone's campaign. from women fruit vendors to doctors and educationalists to town planners and gender experts. Another activist from the campaign in the movement, Usha Kali, has said that ours is a movement of sewage cleaners and sweepers, flower sellers and fishwives. One Right to Pee activist told me that the campaign had evolved from the right to pee to the right to the city, where another talked about the freedom to participate in the city, to move around and to not be stuck indoors, and repeatedly asserted that the struggle was about citizenship. She said, it's not about facilities, it's a political statement. If there are no facilities, she continued, then the city is effectively saying to people, shut up and stay at home. Instead, they are demanding, how do you claim your city as a citizen? As activists well know, this is as much about planning and culture as it is about toilets and drains. And in particular, it's about gender, power, and caste. As Shilpa Padkey and colleagues have written in their book, Why Loiter, if we had to pick one tangible symbol of male privilege in the city, the winner hands down would be the public toilet. When residents and activists feel they are not being heard, however, that sometimes turns to protest of desperate forms. And this includes forms of protest which even use human waste as a form of political expression. These protests draw attention to the lack of basic provisions, such as sanitation in poor neighbourhoods, and they do so in spectacular ways. In South Africa, for example, the Sescona People's Rights Movement has been engaged in protests against inadequate sanitation conditions in poor and marginalised neighbourhoods in Cape Town. The movement began after the municipality provided open-air toilets without walls, which was seen as an affront to dignity. Activists emptied buckets of uncollected waste, human waste, at targeted sites in the city, including the airport, main roads, the government buildings, including the steps of the state legislature, to draw attention to the sanitation struggle of people in the city and to demand dialogue with the authorities. These protests use human waste as a political weapon to create a spectacle and to challenge the social and political order. By placing waste in spaces associated with the elite and often hyper-sanitized city, the protesters aim to disrupt the notion that waste belongs only to the poor urban periphery. The protests engage with the urban sensorium, appealing to the senses and to cultural politics of disgust and contamination. They also highlight the intersections of race, poverty, and urban space, emphasizing the right to a dignified life and the failures of the state to provide basic services. They seek to challenge the post-apartheid government's failure to address poverty, inequality, and social justice and demand universal rights. This form of protest has faced criticism and indeed legal repercussions because it challenges social norms and disrupts established power structures. However, these protests also bring attention to the urgent need for improved sanitation and to place sanitation in a much wider context, one of which is much more alert to the social and environmental and economic inequalities of the post-apartheid city. So campaigns like Septia, Right to Pee, and Sescona position sanitation as a universal right, addressing issues of equality and right across the city. These movements seek to improve sanitation experiences for all, regardless of income and gender. But while these campaigns are rightly universalist in their claims, they are also avowedly spatial and attentive to differences across the urban realm. The right to city life is inherently spatial, encompassing issues of access, planning, governance, and opportunities for participation across the city. It involves understanding who has access to resources and opportunities within urban space and how meaningful participation in urban life can be realized. It's fundamentally an urban and spatial question focused on who gets what, where, why, and how, and it's been articulated in different ways by activists in some of the ways I've described. This attention to spatial difference leaves us with a dynamic and evolving understanding of the right to city life. The right to city life is not static, but constantly evolving and subject to ongoing struggle. It requires more than legal provisions alone and demands a shift in how cities are governed, lived in, and conceptualized. The network nature of sanitation and the challenge it poses necessitates a comprehensive and dynamic approach to addressing the urban sanitation crisis. So the demand then for sanitation for all is universal, but the route to attaining sanitation for all is necessarily varied. plural, and changing, just as cities themselves always are. And this is the argument really at the heart of the book. I develop it by taking 5 different cuts through the urban sanitation crisis, each cut revealing a different aspect that is vital to realizing the right of city life, people, things, life, protest, and allocation. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up in the next few moments, hopefully in a slightly more positive note, to point out that there is a history of interventions that are welfarist and enabling in sanitation in cities. And this also is something I address in the book. And I think of these kind of interventions, these more positive interventions in sanitation, as instances of affirmative sanitation. And just a few examples to give you a sense of some of this. In Salvador, Brazil, 2,000 kilometers of small sewer pipes were built between 1996 and 2004 through state investment, connecting 300,000 homes. In Karachi, Pakistan, the Orangi pilot project of civil society organizations built a network of small sewer pipes, improving public health and local environmental conditions. In Kampala, Uganda, between 2003 and 2015, the government worked with civil society organizations to increase the amount of human waste being treated by 30 times. In South Africa, the eThekwini municipality cross-subsidized water costs for the urban poor and provided more than 80,000 households with toilets. Ethiopia reduced the number of people answering the call of nature in open spaces by more than half by 2015, following a government prioritization of public health. In Nairobi, the Muungano Alliance has brought together community organizations, social movements, and NGOs with community savings funds, donor funds, and bank loans to upgrade housing infrastructure and services, including toilets. Between 2009 and 2016, the Alliance committed over $1.7 million in grants and loans to community-led upgrading projects across Kenya. And across the urban world, there's thousands of these kinds of small-scale interventions led by residents, activists, and practitioners, from toilet blocks in Nairobi or Mumbai that double up as community centres, offering everything from computer classes to libraries to sports clubs and dance clubs, or toilets that siphon biogas to sell to local businesses or residents, such as this one in Nairobi, to ecological sanitation initiatives that seek to generate fertilizer for growing food whilst reducing water use, so-called eco-san or ecological sanitation. And these have gained significant momentum in recent years, particularly in the context of the climate crisis. And they can play a very important role, although they tend to do better. Eco-sanitation initiatives tend to do better in places with lower densities and can struggle with sort of highly dense built-up neighbourhoods in cities. They can struggle to maintain in the longer term in those contexts. There is sometimes a tendency in the kind of the move towards these eco-sanitation experiments. There's a tendency towards small-scale, decentralized ecological sanitation as a kind of more general solution to the urban sanitation crisis. And there's a lot of merit in this. My only kind of criticism here, though, is that this debate around this kind of affirmative sanitation sometimes loses sight of the need for big infrastructure, big capital spend infrastructure, such as sewers, for example. A third of the global urban population lacks access to sewer connections. The sewers are, they have a bad press. They tend to be water intensive, expensive to build, not environmentally super friendly. And we have our own debate in Britain at the moment around sewers and sewage spilling into rivers and coasts across the country, specifically around combined sewers. So that's sewers that collect both rainwater and sewage in the same pipe and how they overflow. So there's a lot of bad press on the sewer as a kind of provision. But sewers can save money over the longer term, even though they're expensive up front. And unlike eco-sanitation, as a form of affirmative sanitation, the sewer can cope very well with very high densities in cities. Away from the world of affirmative sanitation, however, there stubbornly persists another world, another politics that operates with a different sanitation logic, one that is bent on cleaning up the city by displacing the poor, often violently. And this is what I think of as sort of destructive sanitation. So in 2021, for example, the government of Pakistan embarked on a campaign of bulldozing homes and evicting residents who live along the city's narrow waterways, or nullahs. The government, with the support of the Supreme Court, has argued that the clogged nullahs are the cause of floods during the monsoon rains. Activists have countered that the main impetus for the evictions is to clear the way for new roads. And they call on the World Bank, who funds this project, or partly funds this project, to condemn the government demolition and to remove its support. And some have even accused the bank of effectively enabling the evictions. Anyway, as a result, thousands of homes were destroyed, many people were made homeless, compensation that did arrive was not anywhere near enough, children were out of school, adults lost their jobs, there was all kinds of mental and physical health consequences. And sadly, this kind of sanitation intervention, this kind of destructive sanitation, is just as, if not more common than the more affirmative sanitation stories that I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, so to wrap up then, what might be the drivers of change? So the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, in some ways brought sanitation to the forefront of the urban experience. Hygiene became an obsessive focus of COVID-19. Cities became vast arenas of sanitization, washing your hands, disinfecting surfaces. But despite the importance of sanitation to the pandemic, it did not result in any meaningful change for the nearly 1 billion people living in cities with inadequate or no sanitation. In fact, the immediate impact of the pandemic actually worsened sanitation conditions as public toilets were closed off, access to sanitation in schools and workplaces was reduced, and the poorest populations suffered the most because of the lack of access to hygiene supplies, including soap. The economic impacts of the pandemic have further hindered progress in sanitation on the way to that 2030 SDG goal, because governments have cut budgets further for basic provisions like sanitation, and more people have been pushed into extreme poverty. So as the pandemic has receded into the sort of rear view mirror, to say that it was a missed opportunity for transformative change in the global sanitation crisis would be an understatement. However, there are some reasons to be hopeful. There are 4 drivers in particular that advance the affirmative sanitation agenda for the right to city life, which I want to end with. Precedent-setting, mediatized events, urban activism, and the ecological crisis, insofar as the ecological crisis is affirmative. So just briefly, precedent setting. One example here is the Orangi pilot project I mentioned briefly a moment ago. Another example is the work of the Slum Dwellers International Movement, SDI, which if you haven't heard of, you might want to look at. It's an international movement of NGOs and community federations operating in 35 countries across the global south. And one of their strategies is to build community toilet blocks in poor neighborhoods, working with residents and often with the local government. And they build these toilet blocks as what they call demonstration centers. Once one toilet block has been built, it acts as a demonstration to the local government that the communities can, if given the opportunity, participate in solutions to the urban sanitation crisis, including the construction of infrastructures. And so their work has been resourced through state funding, international donors, community savings, and labour contributions, has had significant successes, for example, in India and South Africa. They even run what they call toilet festivals that mark an opportunity to celebrate sanitation, promote awareness of good sanitation, and draw in media attention and municipal and state officials to solution building rather than making the problem worse, as is often the case. So in other words, they produce a series of precedents that act as public demonstrations of what might be done, and which maybe change the dial in terms of the public conversation on sanitation in that city. So that gives, I think, some hope, those kinds of civil society-driven precedents. Secondly, events happen which can change the debate. Sometimes a particular moment captures public or political attention. So one very brief example, in the United States in 2005, there was the establishment of the Restroom Access Act, or also known as Ali's Law, which requires employers to make employee toilets available to any member of the public who needs it, often as a result of medical conditions. And this is because of a story of a teenage girl in Illinois who has Crohn's disease and who was denied access to a toilet in a shopping mall because it was available for employees, not for the public, and who had a very embarrassing accident in a shopping mall, took it up with local media, which then influenced the local state, and then the government in Illinois passed this law, and it's now been taken to other parts of the US and indeed internationally. New Zealand, for example, we're debating this legislation recently. So these are events that generate emotional appeal and media attention, and can become catalysts for action, galvanizing media and political attention. The third driver of affirmative sanitation is urban activism, and I've talked a bit about that, so I won't kind of go on about that again. I've talked about the Right to Pee movement, I've talked about Septia in the United States, and I've talked about Ciscona in South Africa. And I think activists play a vital role in pressuring the states, raising awareness, keeping the struggle on the mainstream agenda, and will probably be very important for any positive changes in this area. And then finally, the kind of climate crisis is, I think, intensifying debates on sanitation, because there's a growing recognition that these two crises, sanitation and climate, are mutually contributing to one another. So, for example, intense rainfalls in places like Dar es Salaam intensifies flooding, which brings human waste around poor neighborhoods on the periphery of the city, and so on. So there's a growing understanding. And just on this last point, a colleague of mine at Leeds University recently published some work, Barbara Evans, based on her research in Kampala with colleagues there, which showed that the sanitation system as it's currently constructed in Kampala is almost half of the city's greenhouse gas emission. So there's a growing recognition that not only is climate change making the sanitation crisis worse, if you want to tackle climate change at the city scale, it really helps to look at how sanitation is being organized and to think about changing it. That's not an easy debate, of course. It's a complicated debate. So these drivers then offer, I think, potential avenues for change, but they face huge challenges. Addressing this issue is partly about changing the law in many places and changing regulations, but it's also about addressing cultural power relations of discrimination against certain racial groups or ethnic groups, or based on caste, for example. So the scale of the response to this has to be, systematic in that sense: cultural, political, legal, economic, environmental, and social. But the urgency of the crisis demands a shift now, because the crisis is not an abstract one. It's being lived now as people wake up in the morning and go to school, try to take the train to work or the bus, try to go to the local market, move through the neighborhoods, jostling through crowds trying to get to toilets that are inadequate. So it is a ongoing, everyday lived crisis which ruins education, health, jobs, family relationships, is associated with social shame, stigma, affects the environment in the way in which wastes seep into soils, rivers, food, and water supplies, and so on. So the book is basically an attempt to say, now is a moment to get onto the kind of sanitation battlefield. It's a crisis that I think that has been too neglected and narrowly understood for too long, not seen as something to rally around, maybe seen sometimes as taboo or embarrassing in some way. And we need, I think, a systematic response in research policy and practice, which is akin to the kind of establishment of a welfare state. That kind of level of global response is increasingly required as cities continue to grow and the solutions seem to be neglected. So for those of us who are concerned with sanitation, I think now is a moment, concerned with cities, now is a moment, I think, to put the sanitation question much more centrally onto the agenda. I'll leave it there because I think I've talked too long. Thank you.